Happy Easter to everybody. It is Easter Monday today. I'm in the sanctuary because I sure missed being here with you yesterday. I know a lot of us did. But when you were in high school or maybe college, did you ever have to read a novel and then write an essay about it, kind of comparing and contrasting two things in a novel, maybe two characters or two different locations or two different episodes, talk about how they're alike and how they're different? You ever do that? Well, it makes me wonder what would happen if we did that with the Gospels, especially with the account of Jesus' resurrection. If we placed Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all side by side and we had to compare and contrast and talk about the way that they told the story of Jesus' resurrection and how they were similar, how they were alike, and how they were different. And well, of course, Jesus being raised from the dead and the tomb being empty, that they would all agree on, all alike. But as I thought about the Gospels this year and the way they tell that story, I realized that John is kind of different. And in looking at all four of those accounts, I think John's is the one that we can really kind of settle into this year, maybe more so than other years. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they all tell the story of the women, plural, arriving at the empty tomb early on Easter morning. And each writer names the women that were there, and they don't always agree on which women that they named, but in those groupings are Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, Salome, Joanna, and the others who were with them, the unnamed others. So it could have been just two of them or three. It could have been half a dozen. We don't really know how many others there were, but there clearly was a them that was at the tomb that morning. To Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Easter is clearly a communal event. These women on the road to the tomb, they are talking to one another. They are planning to anoint Jesus' body together. They wonder amongst themselves who's going to roll away the stone. Didn't think about that. They see the angel speaks to them. Jesus appears to them, and then he tells them to go back and tell his disciples he's risen. And the glory and the joy of the resurrection is really something that is experienced within these relationships, these bonds of friendship and camaraderie with other believers. And I think that's kind of how Easter is supposed to be, you know? And isn't that the way that most of us are quite accustomed to experiencing the joy of Easter and the resurrection in our own lives? And we don't go to an empty tomb together, but we do go to church together. We go together to worship and to celebrate and to be together with our church family and with our friends as we sing together with the choir and with each other this glorious rendition every Easter Sunday of Christ the Lord is risen today, my favorite Easter hymn. But this year, Easter wasn't anything like that at all, was it? Not even close. This year, I think we find ourselves kind of drawn away from that camaraderie that we experience in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and we find ourselves in John's Gospel as John tells us his version of the Easter story. John writes it was early on that first day of the week, and it was still dark. Mary Magdalene, just Mary, came to the tomb as she saw the stone was rolled away from the entrance. And so she ran at once to tell Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved. And she came to them breathlessly panting, "They took the master from the tomb. We don't know where they put him." So Peter and the other disciple, they left and ran to the tomb. They ran neck and neck all the way there. And the other disciple got to the tomb first, outrunning Peter. And so stooping to look in, he sees the linen cloth lying there, but he doesn't go in. And then Simon Peter arrived after him, and he enters the tomb. He goes in and he sees those same linen cloths lying there, and he sees kind of the separate cloth that was used to cover Jesus' head. It's not lying with the other cloths, but it's lying separately, and it's all neatly folded. And then the other disciple, the one who got there first, he goes into the tomb. He takes one look at the evidence and he believes. They didn't know from the scripture yet. They didn't understand about Jesus rising from the dead. So disciples then go back home. But Mary stood outside the tomb weeping. As she wept, she knelt to look in the tomb, and she saw two angels sitting there, dressed in white, one at the head and one at the feet of the place where they had laid Jesus. And they said to her, "Woman, why do you weep?" "They took my master," she said, "and I don't know where they put him." After she said this, she turned and saw Jesus standing there, but she didn't recognize him. And then Jesus spoke to her. "Woman, why do you weep? Who are you looking for?" And she thought he was the gardener. She said to him, "Sir, if you took him, tell me where you put him, so I can go and take care of him," meaning to anoint his body. In that moment, Jesus spoke her name. He said one word to her. He said, "Mary." And then she turned to face him, and she said to him in Hebrew, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Jesus said, "Don't cling to me, for I've not yet ascended to the Father. But go to my brothers and tell them I am ascending to my Father and your Father, my God and your God." And Mary Magdalene went, and she told the disciples, "I saw the Master." And she told them everything he told to her. So what is missing in John's account here that seems so powerful and so present, so obvious in the other three accounts? Community. I mean, who goes to the tomb? It's not a they, not a them, not a we. Simply a she. Not two or three, but merely one. Just Mary. She went to the tomb all by herself, all alone, unaccompanied, with no companion. Now, as for Peter and the other disciple, granted, they appear briefly, but they run all the way to the tomb, and running's not a really good way to have a discussion. And so they run without a word. They don't speak a thing. They arrive to the tomb, they draw their own conclusions, one and then the other, and they never share a word about what they're thinking or feeling or wondering. They deal with the resurrection, the empty tomb, in complete and utter silence. Each one of them still very much alone, even though they're standing there together. And they leave the same way as they came, isolated and silent. And then Mary returns to the tomb, and she encounters a risen Christ all by herself. What I sense here is that for all three of them in John's Easter account, for Mary and for each one of those disciples, this experience is a very personal, very individual kind of thing. Coming to terms with what Jesus did, with who he really is, with what it all meant. It was something that each one of them had to kind of wrestle with and come to terms with themselves, each in their own way and in their own time. And so it is with us on this Easter. We too come to the empty tomb without the physical presence of our community with us, and we arrive at Easter as Mary did, alone and separated from our community. Any Easter hymns that we may want to sing, we're going to sing as a solo, or best case scenario, a duet, or maybe a trio. But Jesus' command to Mary was to go and tell her brothers, to take this solitary encounter she had had with the risen Christ and to go and make it communal. What she had seen and heard and experienced for herself, and now what she finally understood, she would take that to the community of believers. It would help that community of others grow stronger and deeper in their faith. Her individual experience of the risen Christ wasn't just for her alone. It was also meant for others. The they of Easter is still there in John's account. It just takes us a little longer to get there with John and with Mary, that's all. And our experience of the risen Christ, the way that we encountered Christ on Easter morning and the way we encounter him in our lives every day, isn't just for us alone. It is to encourage and strengthen and build up our community of believers. And due to the sheltering in place, it may just take a little longer to get there, that's all. But get there we will. God takes our resurrection solo and he joins it together with the solo of another, and another and another, until a great chorus of resurrection faith resounds, just as Mary's resurrection solo was joined to that of the disciples. And you can see and you can hear how that happens if you watch the video made by Methodists around the globe, a global choir, who began by each one of them individually, all by themselves. They began by sitting down in front of their computer, in their kitchen, and at their table, or standing in an empty sanctuary or an empty choir loft. And each individual person sang their own resurrection solo. And then that solo was joined to the solo of another and another and another. And how their glorious chorus of solos finally came together. And it sounded glorious when those solos were joined one to another to another. And it's attached to this video, by the way, to this email. And if you watch closely enough, You just might see a few folks you know. Christ the Lord is risen, my friends, for you and for us. Christ is risen, indeed.